So hi everyone, my name is Stacey Allen. I work with Ben as a consultant at Learn Quebec. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us in learning more about the role teachers play in reconciliation. I truly believe that learning and teaching about Canada's colonial history is everyone's responsibility, and that it's through building relationships and networking through sessions like these that we can deepen our understanding and impact. So we're honored today to have the opportunity to learn with Lisa Howe. Lisa has worked as an elementary teacher at Western Quebec School Board. She is currently a PhD candidate and a part-time professor at the Faculty of Education for University of Ottawa. She is also the research project manager of Just Because We're Small Doesn't Mean We Can't Stand Tall, Education for Reconciliation in the Elementary Classroom, which is a collaboration between the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and the Faculty of Education at U of Ottawa. So without further ado, I would like to pass the microphone to Lisa.
Thank you so much, Stacey and Ben, for your land acknowledgement. So I will share my screen in a moment with a presentation I've prepared, but I just wanted first you to be able to see me on the screen. This is, I think we've all gotten used to meeting each other in this way virtually, but I wanted to acknowledge that this is not the way that I would normally like to build relations with all of you. So I do value that you're all here, that at the end of what I know is I'm sure a very busy week in your school communities, that you're taking the time to be here with us today. So thank you for that. So I will share my screen now. And as Stacey mentioned, I'll share the slideshow with you. There's lots of links to different resources that I'm talking about. And I really wanted it to be this time to be a time for you to just listen and think and reflect and not have to worry about taking notes or worry about missing anything. Here are my contact information. So I also just want to offer that to you if you have any things that you want to talk about or think about together afterwards or in the months to come. That's my email, and then that's me on Twitter. Okay. So Ben gave us a meaningful land acknowledgement for the territory that he is on right now. But for me, I'm actually on the unceded and unsurrendered ancestral territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. The closest community to where I am in Ottawa is Kitigan-Zibi, which is about a 90-minute drive north from here. And part of our commitments and the commitment of the University of Ottawa and the Faculty of Education is building relations with them and really considering what those relational responsibilities mean in terms of ourselves as visitors on these traditional lands that are unceded, and therefore we're visitors here. So how do visitors act? We've done things, for example, at the university as supporting the moose moratoriums that the Algonquins erected themselves last fall. So we asked them what they needed to help, and we took up some food, warm clothes, etc. And I think that that's what's often missing from land acknowledgements is we have the acknowledgement, we have the thanks, but then what does that mean about our relational responsibilities in terms of action? So just that piece there. All right, so why am I here, and what am I hoping to, what type of learning am I hoping to help you with today? So I'm here in a few different roles. One is as a classroom teacher. So I taught for 12 years at Pierre Elliott Trudeau School in the Western Quebec School Board. And there we had a CLC a community learning center, Now Learn, and I became very involved with the work many years ago. So I'm going to talk to you as a teacher on how you can support your students towards restoring our relations and learning truth and then reconciliation. I'm also going to have my researcher hat on a little bit and talk to you about what I've learned through research with teachers and teacher candidates. And then I'm also here as a Canadian citizen who's a visitor on these lands and who has a history that's tied with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people on these lands. And that, you know, I really feel that it's our collective responsibility to move from a place of learning about an informational stance to learning from. So we'll talk a little bit about all those things. So who am I? Just to situate myself, I'm a fairly new Canadian. My grandmother was a British home child who was sent to Canada to work after her parents were killed in a car accident. I also have recent ancestors from Germany and Scandinavia, and I'm a mom. We have 4 young people that we're raising from 13 to 23. This is an older picture of my family that I'm sure my kids are devastated I'm sharing, but c'est la vie. I volunteer with Teachers for Justice and also Justice for Indigenous Women as part of my relational commitments. I'm a sister, auntie, daughter, partner, and friend. I've been a teacher for many years. I've been a mentor coach. I'm a part-time professor, a PhD candidate, and a researcher. And I'm also, as a human being, I love lots of other things as well. So that's me. That's how I come to this work. And you probably can, from this photo, you can see the era that I was born in, the 70s. This is actually a picture of my brother and my father. And just to show you that I grew up, I was born here on the unceded lands of the Anishinaabe people without having any idea that I was a settler, that I was a visitor. I had no knowledge of these lands. And when I did learn about treaties, I thought that they were historical documents. I didn't actually understand that I was implicated in treaties as well. And I really didn't know anything about Indian residential schools or the 60s scoop or any of the impacts of colonialism, other than what I learned at school, which really was that colonialism was a good thing. And I actually think that I don't really remember knowing that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people were still alive. The way that I was taught was that they were relics of the past. So fast forward quite a few years, and I started to teach at Pierre Elliott Trudeau School Board, where at that time there was about 20% of our student body who were First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And I was teaching, like most of you are familiar with the Quebec curriculum. I was teaching grade 3 at that time, and I was teaching a curriculum that put them in the year 1500, learning about longhouses and wigwams. And in my class, I had 60% of my students were actually Cree from the James Bay communities. And I learned that I was I was not teaching a curriculum that was reflective of their lives, their experiences. And soon I realized it wasn't reflective of the truth either. So to use that saying, I really started to unsettle the settler in myself. And I set out on a quest really to learn truths. And I started to read, I started to spend time with some of my students' families that I became close with. And then I started being able to meet elders and being invited to different communities. So that's how my journey began. So oftentimes when we work with teachers, or when I've worked with teachers at the university, there's this idea that, you know, why do I need to teach this? Or I want to teach this, but I have a lot of worries. And these are some of the most common issues that we see among teachers and teacher candidates. So I don't want to offend anyone. And I think that's a really prolific or pervasive feeling among teachers, is this really strong feeling of not wanting to offend. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you can move past that worry so that you can move into the work. Worries about administrators or associate teachers, in the case of teacher candidates, not supporting me, and then just not knowing enough to teach this, or feeling like they don't have enough resources. And on the other hand, there's, I'm not teaching history, so, you know, why should I be teaching toward reconciliation? And then sometimes we do have teacher candidates who feel really threatened by this sense of, you know, I am a Canadian, I didn't do anything wrong, it wasn't my ancestors. So those are just some of the common feelings that come up, and these are all really normal. And so it's important to talk about them, just, I think, to take the shame away from it, that lots of people are feeling unsure at the beginning. But now we're really going to talk about why it actually is, we really do need to move past that place of anxiety or worry or fear of offending, because this is about human rights in our country, and this is about recognizing how our past and our present and our future is implicated with First Nations and Inuit and Métis people, and it is our responsibility. And I want to show you a clip from 2019. My friend, and who I'm honored to call my friend and colleague, Cindy Blackstock, who is a champion for the rights of First Nations children. She actually took the government of Canada to court in 2007. And in 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal found the Canadian government guilty of racial discrimination against First Nations children. And Cindy is still in court fighting the government to actually implement the findings and the recommendations of the hearing. So she talks about this idea of how colonialism continues to perpetuate racial inequities in Canada. And I'm just going to start it at a certain point here.
You know, this is an important time in the history of our country. An important time when we can actually get to the heart of colonialism. Because colonialism, as Robert Williams, the great Native American legal scholar, said, is really about a bifurcation of the world into two words, the savage and the civilized. And from that kind of context grew countries like Canada, like the United States, like Australia, like New Zealand, and many other nation states as well. The deeming of Indigenous peoples as savage, the deeming of Indigenous peoples as lawless, the deeming of Indigenous peoples as unable, incapable of raising their own children, provided the platform for the rationalization of what is theft and immoral behavior under any other circumstance. But when you dehumanize people by using the savage and civilized dichotomy, many things become horribly possible. And children have found themselves at the front lines of the colonial experiment. For many years in Canada, First Nations children, Métis and Inuit children, were removed from their families to be brought up in a proper way, in a way that was supposed to offer something more than where they came from. And we know that that is not the case. We know, thanks to the survivors, the 60s group survivors and many others, about the horrors of residential schools. We've heard the story of Shani Wenjack, a child himself, who symbolizes many other children who had the courage and the determination to just want to go home. And some didn't make it. And many of us, when we hear those stories, we wish we were alive back then because we would have done something. We would have not been amongst those that normalized it. We would have not been amongst those who stood by while these children suffered. And we know there were people back then who did speak up. One of the big myths is that people of the period didn't know back then, but that's wrong. Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, born just outside of Mount Pleasant First Nation, he is an example of that in 1907, raising the alarm about the prolific deaths of children in residential schools, and that medical science knew just what to do to save them. He gave solutions to the government of Canada. It would have cost $10,000 to $15,000 to save literally thousands of lives, and the government of Canada chose not to do it because it was too expensive. The national budget back then, in 1907, was over $100 million. Now, for those of you who, if you would have seen Cheney or another child walking down the railroad tracks away from the horrible experience of residential school, and say to yourselves, I would have been one of those who stood with him. I would have given him my coat. I would have comforted him, and I would have walked him back home. Then your time is right now. Because there are more First Nations children in child welfare care today than there was at the height of residential schools by a factor of 3. The Canadian government continues to use racial discrimination as a fiscal restraint policy. Now, some may think that's harsh, but I think it's important that we trust ourselves with the truth. You see, the federal government funds public services on reserves, whereas the provinces and territories fund them for all others. And dating back at least to 1907, Dr. Bryce found that one of the undercurrents of the prolific deaths of the children in residential schools was that First Nations people at that time across the country were getting about 1/3 of the health funding that was available to citizens in Ottawa alone. And Dr. Bryce said, even that out, and medical science could make a lot of difference in saving those children's lives. The truth is, those inequalities still persist. Some of you may have seen me on Power and Politics last night, where we were talking about the 2019 budget. And aren't we all grateful that we got $1.2 billion for Jordan's Principle? And I guess I am, but it always makes me wonder, when is First Steps making progress? When does that stop, when Canada's known about these inequalities for 112 years? When do we get to the moment in Canadian history, in our human history, even more importantly, when we say this is no longer morally tenable in a country? It is no longer morally tenable as a human race to say to one child that you get less because of who you are. That is the opportunity in front of us. And the inequalities that these kids have experienced have often become normalized even in the communities themselves, because we've gotten used to just dealing with this inequality.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop there, and I'm gonna try and go back to my. Okay. So we really start to see that the impacts of colonialism are perpetuating these injustices, and we really need a new story, because the one that we've been telling, where we've divided ourselves into these different groups, are perpetuating racisms and injustice. And as Cindy said, your time is now. Your time is right now. And these are really hard things to look at and talk to with our students. But these are the facts of our country. This is what colonialism has done and is continuing to do. So I'm not going to read them out loud to you. You can take a look at them, but these are the types of inequities that are ongoing throughout communities in Canada. And we see how, that these issues really aren't even being talked about in the federal election campaign. Just to, put it in current events. And this is less than 3 months after the country was in deep mourning when the first recoveries of children were made in Kamloops. And this is what's going on. And this, as teachers in Canada, is our context that we're teaching in. And I believe that colonialism is at the root of all these inequities. And I use the word inequity, not issues. I'd like to just encourage you to think about that too. We hear a lot of people using the rhetoric of Indigenous issues, and I think that sugarcoats it. A lot of these issues are actually inequities, and I think that using the word inequity is important, and they are about human rights. And Chelsea Edwards, who was Shannon Kustashion's best friend, and Shannon, of course, was the Attawapiskat student who stood up and said, I don't want to go to school anymore in a school that has mold and where I'm like 3 years behind other students in the province of Ontario. And Chelsea said, we are the kids who have been at the back of the bus our whole lives, and we don't want to be there anymore. So this is why you need to learn about it yourself and then teach about it no matter what grade or subject you teach. And reconciliation and education for reconciliation is really not completely possible when these inequities exist. So we have to start with teaching about them and getting involved in them. And I would say it's your ethical imperative as a teacher to learn and teach the truths of Canadian history and connect them with colonialism as an ongoing practice today. And then to start to take action towards reconciliation. And as Murray Sinclair said, famously, education is what got us here and it's what will get us out. But I also just wanted to touch today on that the Truth and Reconciliation also called for transformational shifts in our pedagogy that facilitates this teaching and learning. And I think this is the real root for teachers who want to teach towards reconciliation, but not sure how, because to do this work, there does require this transformational shift in pedagogy and creating that respectful classroom. And so I'm going to share a little bit about how I've gone about trying to facilitate those transformational shifts. And one person that I've learned a lot from, and I would encourage you to look up, and the link to him is right in the slide that you'll have afterwards. But his name is Dwayne Donald, and he's a Papa's Chase Cree scholar from the University of Alberta. And he uses treaty sensibilities. So he looks at treaties and he says, what can we learn from treaties to help us make a new story? So what are the treaties telling us of how to live as Canadians on this land in respectful and reciprocal ways? Okay, and he really believes that our relationships with each other continue to be influenced by these teachings that emphasize that we don't actually have a relationship, that we're in denial, that we're actually connected. So he's really urging us to think about how we can create new stories and repair what he calls colonial divides. So how do you actually teach towards a new story? That's the question. This is a model that based on Dwayne's work that I've been looking at, and I call it about to from. So I think that for a long time now in schools, we've been teaching about First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, which of course is informational. So we're learning about them, about where they live, about how they live, about who they are, about dates and facts. And in this model, we're going from an informational type of learning to a relational learning. And that's a process that I think starts with you, inside of you, where you start to confront some of those stories that you've grown up with and that you have, and you might not even know that they're there, but the way that we see them and colonial frontier logics, that actually comes from this idea that a lot of us have learned about, that Indigenous people are kind of in one place, like in the fort, right? If we think of Canadian history out west and the forts and the frontiers, they're in one side and we're on another. So it's confronting those, learning about colonial culture. What is that? And then really trying to look at the curriculum and the stories that the curriculum's telling you. And this is what I'm calling unlearning. So how do we go through that unlearning process so that we can get to a place where we're learning from? So I think that that's really starting to understand truths, not just learning and acknowledging truths, but understanding what those truths mean to us here. And then working through things together. So taking out the shame and the feelings of not doing enough, and working through it and taking the time. And then I think we'll get to a place where we have more healing and balance, because the way that we're living, we're often living with these stories that we're telling, and is not a place where we can be relational together. So I've gone over that. So here's some things. So learning and teaching about the land that you're on. And when we say learning about and teaching about the land, well, what does that mean? So it's starting with thinking about yourself and then taking it to your students and working through these things with them. So what's your relationship to the place where you are? What's your history there? Where is it near? What bodies of water is it near? Is it near any sacred sites? And what's your relationship to that? Who's your local community? Who are the local elders? What's the treaty or land agreement that covers this territory, if there is one? And if there's not, what does that actually mean to be on unceded land? And then who are the people that live and lived there? And what's their language and their cultural protocols? And finally, what are the struggles and issues that the traditional keepers of the lands face? So for example, in Ottawa, where I am right now, there's my friend Albert Dumont, who's a spiritual teacher from Kittigon-Zibi. He's really trying to get the local city councillors to rename the John A. Macdonald Parkway that runs near the river in Ottawa, and he wants that renamed. And so one way that I can live out my relational commitments is by supporting him in that advocacy that he's doing. And then really looking at the curriculum. And I think in Quebec, I'm sure, I'm hoping that it's changed somewhat, but I still think that Quebec is quite behind in responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. And when you're looking at the curriculum, you think, what is the story the curriculum's teaching? Does this story help Canadians and Indigenous people see themselves as relatives? And is this story based in Indigenous worldviews and Canadian worldviews? And is it based in understandings of our treaty obligations? So I guess with the curriculum, what I'm saying is that as a teacher, I don't think that we're just deliverers of curriculum. I think that we need to be critiques of it as well. And then finally, I've taken a lot of inspiration from learning from treaties. And I think that when we actually read the treaties, there's over 70 historical treaties and there's 24 modern day treaties in Canada right now. And we can see that the treaties actually tell us how to live together. And I call these treaty sensibilities. And the treaties all have 4 common common characteristics of kinship relations, friendship, mutual obligation, and reciprocity. So I think if we start to read and learn the treaties, not to teach them as facts about the date that they happened, but actually to start learning from the treaty and think about what would a curriculum based on these treaties look like. And then looking at the curriculum in terms of like whose stories and not just the curriculum, but in our own lessons that we or news that we talk about, who's present and who's not. So I often will show teachers that I teach these pictures, and everybody, of course, recognizes this guy on the right as Wayne Gretzky, of course. But what about Tom Longboat, who was a marathoner and Indigenous? We don't really know too much about him. Or Terry Fox. This Terry Fox is celebrated across our country. But what about Gladys Raddick? Gladys has walked across Canada 5 times. She's an amputee. She was in a motorcycle accident when she was 19 years old. And she walks across Canada to raise awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited people. Other examples, we all know Pierre Elliott Trudeau, but what about Harold Cardinal, who actually fought against the white paper that Trudeau had introduced to decimate inherent Indigenous rights? Other ways, so learning to listen and building relations. So this is a picture of my classroom. And this elder Mary Lou, I worked with for years and years, and Mary Lou passed away in the winter of COVID-19. But I worked with her for 10 years. And I think that part of working with elders is not just having them into your, once you have a relationship with one, the way that I did it was she became part of my life. And how I partly did it was after she had come in to talk to us, students wrote letters to her. And then I mailed them to her home, and she loved getting the mail. And then I would call her and I took her out for dinner. She loved barbecue chicken. So so forming these relationships and then nurturing the relationship so that it lasts for years and years. How did I find Mary Lou? Well, that was actually with the help of the CLC or with Learn, and they helped to connect me. And then here's a map that I had on the wall of my classroom, and right away we would all identify where our ancestors were from. And so you can see I had a lot of students in my classroom who were from Cree Nations. And then it also helped the non-Indigenous students situate themselves as visitors to these lands, that they are from somewhere else, and not in a bad way, but just, you know, where did we all come from? Now we're all here together. What does that mean in terms of how we want to move forward? And diving in and exploring inequities with your students. So not being afraid to teach and learn about missing and murdered Indigenous women, or about the other inequities that exist. And getting out in the community and taking the calls to action. You know, after you've done your learning, get involved, and again, learn, and has lots of support for you to get involved in different initiatives that are going on. So I really do believe that to do this work, having a classroom where everyone feels that they belong is really important. So I've just written a few ways that I would do that. So, you know, greeting each and every student, having a meeting, daily circles, a lot of student choice and student voice. And that community created a situation where we were really able to safely, respectfully talk about these inequities in ways that I think that everyone felt honored and safe. And yes, there were feelings of sadness, but we were able to move through those together because of the relationships we had with each other. And so I really believe that transformative teaching and learning fosters the calls to action in our classrooms, and then gives us a space and place to learn Indigenous perspectives, voices, ways of knowing, teaching and learning the truth, having an understanding that colonialism is ongoing. It helps us disrupt the myths and stereotypes, and we also need opportunities, of course, to engage with communities. And then we can start to take steps towards reconciliation as an action. And I would say that the most important and powerful resource you have lies within you. So there's a lot of resources since the TRC closed in 2015 that's been put out there. But if you haven't gone through that work yourself, or if you're not sure of it, you can have all the resources in the world, but you still might not be ready to take the dive. So I'm really encouraging you and cheering you on to really start to do that unsettling work in yourself, so that you can perhaps be in the position to be what Friari says, that, you know, education does not change the world, it can change people, and then people can change the world. So however, though, there's a lot of resources, and resources are important. So I've the last few slides are all resources that I've put together for you. So Orange Shirt Day, there's lots of different ways you can get involved virtually and not virtually. The Caring Society, which I do a lot of work at, has incredible resources that you can use. And I'm happy to spend time with any of you who want to go through any of those resources in depth. Project of Heart, of course, has lots of great resources for learning about residential schools. And then these are other resources that are already made with lessons to help you dive in. But I really want to leave you with this understanding that learning and action go together, because as Cindy says, how can there really, like, we have reconciliation means not having to say sorry a second time. So what are we going to do, and what are we going to help our students do so that we can get towards reconciliation? And starting now, we all have an opportunity to show leadership, courage, and conviction in helping heal the wounds of the past as we make a path towards a more just, more fair, and more loving country.
Thank you again, Lisa, for taking your time out of your day to speak with us and your willingness to share all of your resources with us. This work is definitely not easy, and it can be really intimidating to begin, but it is our responsibility as individuals and educators to teach about the present and past inequalities. Also, another big thank you to all of our participants today for taking another step towards becoming allies. This session is only the beginning, so Learn is planning on hosting more sessions throughout the year to give participants opportunities to network with other people who are doing this work and discuss their own efforts and journey. Our goal is to make the future sessions more interactive. So if you haven't already, we invite you to register for the Learn Ed Rec newsletter, where you can learn about our future sessions when they're available. And we'll post the registration link in the chat. We're also hosting a virtual Orange Shirt Day on September 30th. So if your class is doing something around the topic of Orange Shirt Day, we welcome them to attend our event and share their learning with other students from across the province. There will be 2 sessions, one for elementary and one for secondary students. And we'll post a link in the chat with the registration details for that as well.